For those of you who don't know, my name's John Foster. I'm a reference librarian at Mentor Public Library. I have a PhD in history from the University of Washington, in addition to several other arguably more useful degrees. And I wanted to do this talk today about the sink of the Bismarck for a couple of reasons. There's a lot of things you could talk about in naval warfare, but I think the Bismarck is interesting. The saga of the Bismarck, the sort of 12 days of its operational life in a way, are interesting because this is the last of the great ship-to-ship battles in the history of naval warfare. So after this, I mean, there's a sort of a progression. There's this series of engagements, and then there's the Battle of Midway, at which it becomes clear that naval aviation is going to be, the carriers are the new power in sort of fleet warfare. Navies are, like armies, often fighting the last battle. So the British Navy after 1815 was the most powerful navy in the world. But interestingly enough, they then spent a century not fighting because there was no navy in the world that could stand up to them. So then they came to the First World War. There had been a kind of a naval arms race leading up to it. And when the First World War happens, the German Navy spends a lot of the time at their base in Wilhelmshaven. I mean, there's actually relatively little. The Germans realized, I think, pretty quickly that going toe-to-toe with the British Navy was a losing proposition. And the only time that this changed really was the Battle of Jutland, 1917, at which 3 British battle cruisers received strikes that penetrated their decks and went through into their magazines, and they blew up. Although Battle of Jutland really is a win for the British, but it was very costly. But here's the difference. So if you watch like the old movies of naval combat, what do you see? You see ships sailing kind of in line along each other and firing at each other side to side. What changed in naval warfare was that now you got guns that were so big that you didn't need to be doing that. And as a matter of fact, so for instance, the Bismarck's guns had an operational range of officially right about 13 miles. No, excuse me, 18 miles, not 13. They got more effective as they got a little closer. So instead of firing at the side of another ship, what you're doing is firing a shell that goes up in the air. At 18 miles, it takes about 50 seconds for one of these shells to reach. And what you're looking for it to do is not go in the side of a ship where the armor belt is, the thickest armor, but to go through the deck. And this is going to be a key feature. So this is the Bismarck. She's in the Baltic. This is during her workup cruise. So when a ship would be commissioned, when it was built, they'd have to have a cruise to make sure all the stuff worked. So the Germans were limited first by the Versailles Treaty and then by the Naval Treaty of 1935 to ships that only weighed 10,000 tons, which is relatively small. So the building of the Bismarck was an exercise in obfuscation. You know, the observers kept saying, well, this seems like rather larger than 10,000 tons. The standard displacement for the Bismarck when she was finally completed was 32,000 tons and a little change. But by that time, all bets were off. I mean, this is, you know, Hitler comes to power, 1932, 1933. He views, you know, at the best of times, Hitler viewed the treaties as kind of more in the nature of a suggestion, and at the worst of times, and that those come around pretty quickly, he really viewed them as an impediment that he was just going to sort of get past. The Bismarck is really, the Germans call it a battleship. There's an interesting thing about names. So there's kind of dreadnoughts, which are the big ships that come around the First World War. And then you get sort of names for ships like cruiser and battleship and battle cruiser. And there's not a sort of hard and fast definition of what they are. A battleship really is meant to be a ship that's ready to go toe-to-toe with the biggest ships of the opposition. So before the Germans built the Bismarck, they built the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are smaller than Bismarck, and they have 11-inch guns. They're really meant as commerce raiders. Yes?
What year was it?
So Bismarck is laid down in 1939. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are built, I think, in 1930. The keel is laid down. It takes a long time. And then they build it, and then once they build it, it doesn't get commissioned until February of 1941. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, I think, were laid down in 1937 or 38. I think 38. And they're clearly meant as commerce raiders. So if we go back to the theories of naval warfare of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great theorist, American theorist of naval warfare, there's basically two theories of naval warfare. One is control, and that's the British theory. The British is, we have the ships, the largest navy, we're going to control the sea lanes. So we're going to go where we want, when we want. We have all this trade, all these bases, and we're going to do what we want. The Germans realize that they can't do that. Even with half of the German fleet, or half of the British fleet, taking care of the British Empire, right, the Germans still can't build enough ships to really directly challenge the British. And they really don't think they're going to. The Germans really thought that their naval enemy was going to be the French. They didn't realize that the French were going to fold up like a gum wrapper in 1940. So what you get, and Hitler never thought he was going to have to invade Britain. He thought that the Britons would eventually see reason. We're Aryans, you're kind of Aryans, we're all kind of okay together, you can't stand up against us, really. And then when he realized after a while that he couldn't, he went to the Kriegsmarine, he went to Erich Raeder, the Grand Admiral, the head of the Kriegsmarine, and said, well, I want to invade, I need you to give me a plan for invading Britain. And he came back a couple of weeks later and said, we just can't do it. We don't have the ships. We don't have air superiority. The Germans had not taken the precaution, by the way, of recalling their merchant fleet before they invaded France. This is always a good thing to do. If you're going to get into a conflict, the first thing you want to do is recall your merchant fleet. And the reason being that all those German ships that were in ports on the other side, so to speak, were immediately seized. So the Germans lost a large proportion of their merchant fleet. They didn't have the transport ships to get over there. So what the Germans thought was, well, the British blockaded us during the First World War, and we blockaded them too, I mean, through submarine warfare. And they nearly starved each other out. As a matter of fact, if you want to talk about the end of the First World War, I mean, one big reason was mutual exhaustion. One big reason was the influenza epidemic. But one big reason was that the Germans were starving. The winter of 1918 and 1919 is referred to in German history as the hunger winter, because there just was no food there. And it was because the British naval blockade was so successful. And the Germans knew, right, that the British import a large proportion of their foodstuffs. So if they can stop that, then they get a leg up on beating the British. And this is why they build Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, they're smaller ships. They displace in the mid 20,000 ton range. But they only have 11-inch guns. And what they're made for is commerce raiding. They're the British, I think, came up with this term, the pocket battleship. That's what they called. That's what they called. But Bismarck is really meant to be a battleship. Bismarck and her sister ship, the Tirpitz, laid down in 1939 at the Blumenvaz shipyards in Hamburg. She's really meant to be a ship that could slug it out with the opposing navy's biggest ships. She has a max rated speed of 31 knots, which is fast. And she can do it in heavy weather. So a lot of times the rated speed and what the speed in bad weather is going to be noticeably different. Bismarck could do 31 knots in heavy seas. She's about 230 meters long, roughly. She's 30 meters wide in the beam, so almost 100 feet, which means she's relatively wider than most ships of her class, which means that she's a steadier gunnery platform. She's armed with 8 15-inch guns. A 15-inch gun is an enormous piece of, a 15-inch shell is about that long and is an enormous, enormous piece of ordnance. Her belt armor is about 12 inches thick. That's around the sides. And her deck armor is between 3.9 and 4.7 inches thick. So that's key. And why is that key? Because that means that she has a better chance of not getting punctured by a plunging shell. She's got heavier armor around her magazines to try and stop what happened to the British cruisers happening. She's commanded by Sea Captain Ernst Lindemann and Vice Admiral Günther Lütjens. Lütjens the year before, and by the year before I mean 1940 now, had commanded Operation Berlin, which was a commerce raiding mission involving the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, where they went out around into the Azores, then into the Indian Ocean, came back. And that was their sort of sea denial theory, right? So once again, this is 1941. The U-boat blockade is slowly starving the British. So in May 1941, just to shift scene for a moment, a British seaman named George Packham, he's a 19-year-old able-bodied seaman, was standing aboard the observation platform of the HMS Suffolk. HMS Suffolk was a heavy cruiser. She and her sister ship, the HMS Norfolk, were patrolling the southern end of the Denmark Strait, which is the passage between Iceland and Denmark. It was a nasty job. It was alternately snowing and raining. The temperature was around freezing. They normally would be on watch for 3 or 4 hours on these open platforms. The captain of the Suffolk had said, well, no, we're only going to do 1 hour or 2 hour watches because it's so unpleasant out there that people will lose focus, and we need to have people at their sort of maximum attentiveness. About 7:30 at night, this is the 21st of May, it stays late at that latitude in May. The guy standing next to him, whose name was Alf Newell, said that he saw something, and Packham turned around. The weather cleared briefly, and he saw 2 enormous ships looming out in the distance, and he had 2 immediate, very unpleasant realizations. The first was that the Bismarck had run the Denmark Strait and was now on the point of breaking out into the open Atlantic. If she was allowed to do so, she would immediately become the most lethal commerce raider that any navy had ever sent to sea. But there was a second realization, and it occurred when he heard the radar man say, ship bearing 140, green, 12,000 yards, right? Which means there's a ship bearing 140, so naval directions are on a 360-degree compass. Green means it's off to starboard. Red, in British naval parlance, means port. Green means starboard. And that it's 12,000 yards away. 12,000 yards to the, might sound like a long way. That's just under 6 nautical miles. But 12,000 yards in terms of naval gunnery is point-blank range. And Packham knew without having to be told that if the Bismarck turned her guns on the Suffolk at this moment, that life on the Suffolk would become kind of like life in Thomas Hobbes' State of Nature. Nasty, brutish, and short. Like there was really nothing that the Suffolk could do, especially at 6 nautical miles, if the Bismarck should choose to attack. So the captain of the Suffolk immediately realizes the same thing, that this is an existential threat to everybody on board and the ship itself. So he orders a hard turn to port into a fog bank. Now, 2 things work together here for the Suffolk, right? One was that the captain of the Bismarck had been ordered not to engage if he could avoid it with enemy ships. And the other was that the role of the cruiser, the role of the heavy cruiser, was not to engage with a capital ship, but it was to shadow the capital ship, to follow it, keeping an eye on it and leading its side's capital ships to where it was. So what they saw was the Bismarck in the lead, and then her consort, the Prinz Eugen. Prinz Eugen is a heavy cruiser. It has 8-inch guns. This is Prinz Eugen. And their silhouettes look very much alike, a fact which will come into play in a little bit here. But what the captain of the Suffolk did was he waited in the fog bank until the Bismarck had gone by. The Suffolk had radar. The Bismarck had radar too, but the Suffolk had 360-degree radar, or mostly 300. It didn't work directly to stern because there was part of the ship blocked the radar emitter, but it had 350-degree radar, we'll say. So what he did was he waited for the Bismarck to go by, and then the Norfolk and the Suffolk began a really hair-raising sort of game of cat and mouse where they had to follow the Bismarck but stay far away enough that the Bismarck wouldn't shoot them. And periodically, the Bismarck would sort of turn. And once the Bismarck opened up on the Norfolk was the sister ship. So here's the Suffolk, and here's the Norfolk. And the Bismarck opened up on the Norfolk. Right when she did, the Norfolk's captain ordered a hard turn to port, and the Norfolk sailors saw the shell splashes hit in the sea where they would have been if they had kept going straight. But another consequence of this was that Bismarck had a forward radar, and the recoil from the guns, the pressure recoil from the guns, knocked out their forward radar. So, just to back up, how had the Bismarck got there? She and Prince Eugen had been stationed at Gdynia, or Gotenhafen as the Germans call it, Gdynia in present-day Poland. Why had she been stationed there? Well, that was to get her out of the range of Allied bombers. So the Germans are not yet at war with the Soviet Union, but they are at war with the British, and the British can bomb Germany. They don't have a huge bomber fleet as they will in 1943 and 1944, but they have enough planes to get over there and let the Germans know that they're not thrilled with how things have been going, generally speaking. So the Germans have planned this operation, Operation Rheinübung, Operation Rhine exercise. And once again, what it's meant to be is to get the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst out into the naval shipping lanes. And this is key. In the first half of 1941, Britain has lost 750,000 tons of merchant shipping to submarine warfare. They're slowly strangling. And the way that they had come up with to counter this threat, right, was the convoy system. So you would send a bunch of ships out, they'd have a destroyer escort. Destroyers' primary job, not their sole job, but one of their primary jobs is anti-submarine warfare. If a submarine rocked up on the convoy scatters. Some of them might get sunk, but most of them survive, right? But if a ship like the Bismarck rocks up on your convoy, then you've got a much different problem, because a ship like the Bismarck can pop a merchant ship at anything under about 20 miles, right? And if they do, the chances that a large number of those ships are going to the bottom along with their cargoes goes up dramatically. So the British Admiralty was very nervous about the idea of the Bismarck getting out into the open Atlantic and being able to raid the sea lanes. The Germans had been planning this Rheinübung for several months. It had gotten delayed a couple of times. Lütjens was very anxious to get them out there and going, right? Because this is May of 1941. Lütjens is well enough placed in the Nazi hierarchy to know, or in the military hierarchy to know, that the invasion of the Soviet Union is happening, and what he doesn't want to have happen is for them to get stuck in the Baltic fighting against the almost non-existent navy of the Soviet Union, right? So he wants to get out there. So finally on the 21st of May, they managed to go, and at first they're noticed, the Swedish government notices, Swedish coastal observers see two large German warships and 5 or 6 destroyers going through the Kattegat, the strait between north of Denmark. And they report this to the British Admiralty, because the Swedes are neutral, but only sort of. But then nobody really knows where the Bismarck is. As an aside, we have some really interesting pictures. There was a film crew on the Scharnhorst, or on the Prince Eugen. And there is the Bismarck. There are a couple of crewmen on the Prince Eugen. So we have some kind of pictures of what it looked like. And this is the Bismarck sailing off at the beginning of Rheinübung in the 3rd week of May, 1941. So this is on the 18th of May at around 6 o'clock, Prince Eugen sails. Then at 2 o'clock the next morning, Bismarck sails. And then nobody knows where they are for a couple of days. On May 21st at 1:15, a British pilot named Michael Suckling, flying a reconnaissance Spitfire out of RAF Wick in northern Scotland, spots the Bismarck in a fjord south of Bergen. Takes these aerial photographs of her. She's got a couple of merchant ships with her here. The reason is, if a submarine comes up the fjord, they want to have something they can put in the way so it doesn't hit the Bismarck. Why? Because the Bismarck cannot maneuver. So the thing you really want if you're in a big ship with somebody shooting torpedoes at you, is to be able to shift so they can comb and miss. But the Bismarck can't do that here, so her next best option is to have these other ships around that hopefully will get in the way of any torpedo that gets fired at her. The British Admiralty then mobilizes, and why? Because they know that the prospect of Bismarck getting out into the open Atlantic is an existential threat. So the home fleet, which is based at Scapa Flow, if any of you have ever been to the Orkneys, or most of you probably haven't, it's a beautiful but very harsh place. Scapa Flow is up in the Orkney Islands northwest of Scotland. It's so harsh that after the First World War they interned the German Navy, and they brought a lot of the men to Scapa Flow where they put the British fleet, or the German fleet. They sort of held it kind of in internment. And one of the German officers, when he got out on deck and saw the place, he said, "You guys spent 4 years here?" And the officer next to him said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, then you deserve to win." But the British fleet mobilizes from Scapa Flow. So there's 3 ways that they can get down into the Atlantic. They can go through the Shetland-Orkney Gap, but that's really close to Scapa Flow, so that's probably not a great idea. They can go through the gap between the Faroe Islands and Iceland, or they can go through the Denmark Strait. The Denmark Strait is normally about 150 miles wide. At this time of year, it's more like 50 miles wide because of pack ice on the Denmark side, or on the Greenland side, whereas there's a current that goes up the Iceland side that makes it very foggy. And this is why the captain of the Suffolk, in order to keep himself from being pounded to splinters by the Bismarck, went hard to port into a fog bank to save himself. So this encounter, this is the Denmark Strait, this is the coast of Greenland, here's Iceland, and it takes place right here. We know exactly why, because we know exactly where, because of course the Suffolk is radioing back the precise coordinates of where they are so that the British home fleet can respond. Oh, by the way, I just like this. This is Robert Myrick Ellis, the captain of the Suffolk. This is during the chase. He's eating what looks to be a biscuit of some kind. Mostly when they were serving in these areas, it was a nasty place to serve. The seas were very rough, often upwards of 20 feet. There's all sorts of details. British naval historians love to tell you things that you'd prefer not to know. Like that in these heavy seas, a lot of times the toilets would overflow, and that people's stomachs would be in the sort of condition that you might imagine, and that nobody cleaned it up because they just didn't have time. Like, you know, it was just like when we get into port, and the people in Suffolk, this crew of the Suffolk was very upset because they had been sent back to Reykjavik to refuel, and they thought they were going to get a few days because they'd spent 2 weeks out in the Denmark Strait before that. And then immediately, like while they're refueling, they get a message from the Scapa Flow saying, as soon as you're refueled, you need to head straight back out into the Denmark Strait, rejoin the first cruiser squadron, and search for the Bismarck. So, oh, great, more time out there. Also, when the seas were rough, they couldn't really cook you hot food because for reasons that especially any of you who've been on a warship will know. So they spent most of their time eating what's called bully beef. Bully beef is kind of the British equivalent of Spam. So they would give you bully beef sandwich. The cooks would come around and just give you bully beef sandwiches wherever you were, which I don't think it would take very long for that to get very old. So standing around in the cold in a ship that's moving quite extensively and eating horrible food. So the British Admiralty sends, so the Suffolk and the Norfolk are pursuing the Bismarck. And the British Admiralty sends the 2 best ships that they have in the area, the HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales, who've been sort of patrolling south of Iceland. Hood was laid down in 1921. She's a big ship, and she was the biggest ship in the British Navy at that point. She had spent much of the interwar years sailing around, sort of being the expression of British naval power. She's a beautiful ship. She had a crew of 1,418. She mounted 8 15-inch guns. But here's a key fact about the Hood. So Hood is a battle cruiser, and a battle cruiser is basically an extinct evolutionary line in naval warships. Because a battlecruiser is meant to be, so a naval warship can be fast, well-armed, or heavily armored. It can be any two of those three things, right? Fast, heavily armored, big guns. So if it's fast and has big guns, you have to sacrifice weight by making it less armored. If it's fast and heavily armored, the ordnance has to be smaller. If it's heavily armored and well-armed, it's not going to be that fast. And a good example of this trade-off is the HMS Rodney, who comes into the story a little later, who sports 16-inch guns and very heavy belt armor, but can only go 23 knots. So if Bismarck is going at its max speed, Rodney has no chance of catching it. But she does, and we'll find out why. Bismarck could do between 29 and 31 knots. But she's very lightly armored, and you can see, not very lightly armored, excuse me, but they tried to sort of save weight. So you can see that the deck back here is very low. And the reason was that they wanted to, every inch of ship back here increases the weight. So what they wanted to do was try to keep the weight low. She has 4 twin 15-inch gun turrets. She's about 260 meters long, roughly 104 feet in the beam. So in a lot of respects, similar in size to Bismarck. Her belt armor is between 6 and 12 inches, but her deck armor is between 0.75 and 3 inches, and especially less back toward the rear of the ship. And you'll notice that that's only about 50 to 75% of the deck armor strength of the Bismarck. Prince of Wales, by the way, is a new battleship. She's laid down in 1935. Prince of Wales is part of the new, or 38, excuse me, the new group of British battleships that are really for real battleships. She has 15-inch guns, but she's also more heavily armored and faster. I mean, she's up around 30, her operational speed is about 30 knots. But she's very new. She was so new that she had not had her workup cruise by the time she was sent out to fight the Bismarck, with the result that she had a lot of technicians still on board, and the guns were so, the hydraulic system of the guns was so prone to malfunction that the gun crews had to wear oilskins in the turret because the guns were constantly leaking hydraulic fluid everywhere. So this is Lionel Holland, Vice Admiral Lionel Holland. He's the commander of the group, and then that's Captain Ralph Kerr, who's the actual commander of captain of the Hood. This is the last known picture for real picture, we'll get to what I mean by that in a second, of the Hood. This is taken from the A turret of the Prince of Wales. So what Holland's idea is that he wants to sort of cross the T. This is the sort of the gold standard of naval warfare. So if you have an enemy going like this and you sail across him in front, you can train all 4 of your main turrets on him, but he can only fire at you with his forward turrets. So you then have an advantage, right? So that's what Holland wants to do. And he sets a course based on the information that he's getting from Norfolk and Suffolk. But Norfolk and Suffolk, for a crucial period, lose sight of the Bismarck in the course of their pursuit. And in that time, Bismarck changes course by about 20 degrees, so that when Hood catches sight of Bismarck at 5:35 on the morning of May 24th, instead of sailing onto her like this, Hood is sailing like this, and Bismarck is sailing like this. So Holland has a choice to make. He's 23 miles away when they spot them. And what he's worried about, for reasons that will probably be obvious from the things that I've said, is the prospect of plunging fire. So what he wants to do is get in close to the Bismarck fast, so that Bismarck won't be able to drop plunging shells on top of him. So he takes this very fateful decision. Also, his observers get it wrong. In fact, the Prince Eugen is the first ship of the two. They have very similar silhouettes, although Prince Eugen is smaller. But it's hard to see in the early dawn light. But Bismarck, because her radar had gone out when she shot at the Norfolk, had ordered Prince Eugen to take the lead because her radar wasn't working. So Holland takes this decision. They're going to go straight at the Bismarck, try and get in so they don't get plunging fire on top of her. At 5:53, Hood opens fire at a distance of 26,000 yards, so roughly 13 nautical miles. That's right in the Goldilocks zone, if you want to call it that, of her naval gunnery. At first she starts firing at the Prince Eugen, and she tells the captain of the Prince of Wales, you fire at Prince Eugen, you fire at that ship too, because they think it's the Bismarck. And they fire their first 3 salvos the wrong ship. Prince of Wales, because she has better gunnery optics, the gunnery officer realizes pretty quickly and tells the captain, that first ship isn't the Bismarck, it's the second one. That's the one we need to be shooting at. So they relatively quickly changed their fire to the Bismarck, and they managed to get several salvos, although the Prince of Wales doesn't really hit anything. And within a fairly short time, 2 of her guns malfunction. So she's not firing her full complement. Bismarck, Hood, on the other hand, is setting up a very heavy pattern of fire, and she puts one shot through the bow of the Bismarck. The shell doesn't explode, it goes straight through the bow and hits and explodes in the sea on the other side. But you can see, this is a picture taken from Prince Eugen. Here you can see flashes from the shots fired by the Hood. This is once again from Prince Eugen. There you can see the Bismarck opening up with her naval guns. The Bismarck waited for a couple of minutes. Lütjens wasn't sure who he was facing. And he wanted to make sure what was going on, and he'd also been told, hey, I don't want you to get into a toe-to-toe shooting match. Finally, Lindemann, this is one of my favorite lines, the captain is getting progressively more annoyed, and finally Adalbert Schneider, the head gunnery officer, calls up and says, Frage Feuererlaubnis, permission to fire. And Lütjens doesn't say anything, so finally Lindemann says, Ich lasse mir doch nicht mein Schiff unter dem Arsch wegschießen, which means, I'm not getting my ship shot out from under my ass. And he gives the order to fire. At 5:55, Bismarck opens up. Her first 3 shots are not close, her first 3 salvos. Her first salvo is very close. Her 5th salvo straddles the Bismarck, and what happens next is a matter of some conjecture. The British had 2 inquiries after this engagement, trying to figure out what had happened. But probably what happened was that a shell from Bismarck penetrated the rear deck of the Hood, went into her 4-inch gun magazine, which was right next to her 15-inch gun magazine, detonated there, that exploded, the 15-inch gun magazine exploded, and what we do know is that witnesses said that a pillar of fire, one sailor who saw it said it looked like a flame from a blowtorch, shot up about 300 feet in the air. And then there was a massive explosion which blew the stern of the ship completely off the ship. And you can see, picture was taken from Prince Eugen, you can see in the distance, that's, we think, Hood exploding. There were only 3 survivors from the Hood. She sank in 3 minutes. 2 of them were on the steering deck. And one of them said, the ship started to heel over to port. No order was given to abandon ship. You didn't have to. We all knew. I mean, when a ship does that, you know that you need to get off it right away. These are the 3 survivors: Alf Briggs, Bob Tilburn, and William Dundas. Briggs and Tilburn, if I recall correctly, were on the navigation deck, and one of them, and I think it's Briggs, said, we were going over, and we all were going out one door, and the commander beside me, stood aside and let me go through the door, and that was the last he saw of him. The bow of the ship flipped up in the air, and the sailors on the Bismarck saw the forward turret, the A turret, the Bismarck, fire one more shot that went straight up in the air, and they were all like, wow, that's impressive. Those guys, they know their ship is going down, but as a sort of sign of defiance, they're firing their last salvo. The ship sank incredibly quickly. All 3 of those seamen report being pulled down by the mains of the ship, and then finally what happens when a ship goes down is that the weight of the water compresses it and shoots all the air out of it. And all three of them reported being taken up. You know, they were just about to drown and they were sort of shot up to the surface by the water escaping when the compartments collapsed in the sinking ship. They were eventually rescued by the British Navy after the sort of scene cleared. Several destroyers showed up and they were preparing, you know, they'd made all these preparations to pick up survivors, and they only found the 3. The Prince of Wales then realizes this is bad news, right? Because at the beginning of this conflict, the British actually have the advantage. Prince of Wales and Hood outgun the Bismarck, and the Prince Eugen is just a cruiser. So it has no chance of standing toe-to-toe with either of these British ships. But now that the Hood has been sunk, and the Prince of Wales guns are not all functional, the Prince of Wales the captain of the Prince of Wales has a decision to make. They sustained, I think, 7 direct hits from Bismarck and Prince Eugen, and then they moved off. So you can see, this is the map of the battle. This is where Hood opens fire, or first sights the Bismarck at 5:37. This is where the Hood opens fire. This is where the Bismarck opens fire. This is where the Hood is sunk. The Battle of the Bismarck Strait lasts about 15 minutes. And then you can see the Prince of Wales decides at 6:05 decides to retreat. The outcome of this battle was shocking to the British Admiralty. They couldn't believe that it had happened. Nobody could believe that the Hood had been sunk. The Hood was the flagship of the British Navy. Churchill was entertaining Averell Harriman, the representative, Franklin Roosevelt's representative, and it was a worrisome time for Churchill, because Churchill is wanting to show the U.S. government that the British can fight, right? Because what he's afraid of is that the U.S. government will decide, well, Britain's a lost cause, we're not going to come in on their side. So Churchill's very upset about this. He wanted to have a board of inquiry on the captain of the Prince of Wales, say, well, why didn't you stay and fight? And other members of the Admiralty said no. Like there was no chance he was going to be able to recoup the situation then. But what happens then is the British Admiralty says, okay, we can't have the Bismarck out in the sea lanes. Bismarck continues to sail to the southwest. Norfolk and Suffolk keep trying to shadow her, but eventually they lose her. And then things get bad. Because now you don't know where the Bismarck is. And it has a lot of options about where it can go, right? It can go out into the open Atlantic. Or if it wants to refuel, the Germans have captured the French naval ports on the coast, Brest and Saint-Nazaire. Brest has a massive deep water harbor with dry docks, the whole McGill. And as a matter of fact, that's where Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are currently being repaired. So the British have no idea where Bismarck is. And they don't for the best part of a day. Finally, at 10:30 on the 26th of May, she's spotted by a Catalina flying boat, which is being flown by the RAF out of Northern Ireland, out of Lough Erne in Northern Ireland, by a flying officer named Dennis Briggs, who's partnered, by the way, by a U.S. observer, Ensign Leonard B. Smith. And Smith is actually at the controls when they spot the Bismarck. And then the British are like, well, what we're going to do? So what they do is they mobilize every ship that they have in the neighborhood, partly because of the danger posed by the Bismarck, and partly out of a sense of revenge, right? The British are angry. You know, most of the people in the British Navy know somebody who was serving on the Hood. The Hood has a crew of 1,418 men, 1,415 of whom are now dead. The British Navy says, okay, Prince of Wales, you need to try and get back in the fight. Norfolk and Suffolk, you follow if you can. They order a squadron involving the Ark Royal, one of their aircraft carriers, from Gibraltar, along with the light cruiser Sheffield and the battle cruiser Renown. The heavy cruiser London is escorting a convoy off Gibraltar. It's ordered into the Eastern Atlantic. The light cruiser Edinburgh, but also the battleship Rodney and the King George V. King George V is the sister ship of the Prince of Wales, and there's another new battleship. Rodney is an old battleship, but she has 16-inch guns. She's not very fast. But if she can get into the right position, she can be effective. And also the aircraft carrier Victorious. HMS Electra, by the way, is the ship that picks up the survivors. Sorry to forget about that. Here you can see, this is Prince Eugen, that's Bismarck after the Battle of the Denmark Strait. And here are her options. So the Battle of Denmark Strait takes place here. She could go back home if she wanted to. She could go this way and then maybe head toward the occupied territories, or she could go out into the open Atlantic to raid commerce. So what first happens is the British launch, once they locate her, a flight of torpedo bombers from the HMS Victorious. This is an incredibly brave thing that these guys are doing. The seas are so heavy that the front of the bow of the ship is touching the water as it goes down into the waves, and the flight officer on the deck has to time when he lets the planes go so that the ship will be heeling upward when they go. This is a Ferry Mark IV torpedo plane. The pilots used to call them string bags. It's basically fabric over a wooden metal frame. I think its top speed was about 110 miles an hour. But it had some advantages. And when they came to attack the Bismarck, although this flight from Victorious didn't hit the Bismarck with any of its torpedoes, first, because they were made of fabric, a 20 millimeter aircraft shell will go through this plane, and if it doesn't hit anything more substantial than the fuselage, it'll just keep going. So one of these planes took 100 fragmentary hits on its flight and still managed to make it back. Also, this I learned from Angus Constam's book on the Bismarck. The anti-aircraft guns are made to transit at a certain rate of speed, and it's geared to how fast a sort of top-of-the-line torpedo bomber will go, like an American Devastator torpedo bomber. But these things are so slow, and the wind is so heavy that they're moving side to side quite dramatically, that it's hard for the German anti-aircraft gunners to actually to slow the transit of their gun down to the point that they can actually hit one of these things. And in fact, none of these planes, there's 3 raids on the Bismarck. Not one of these planes is shot down by Bismarck's anti-aircraft. As a matter of fact, one of the things that Bismarck tried to do was fire shells into the sea to create sort of water spouts to make it harder for the planes to get in, because they just couldn't hit them with their anti-aircraft. Late on the evening of the 24th, the Ferry Swordfish torpedo bombers from Victorious raid on the Bismarck. They score 1 hit. It's on the armor belt, does no damage. Now things are getting more fraught for the British, because we get around to the 26th, and what's happened? It's had all these ships steaming it as fast as they can go, and they're getting toward the end of their available fuel. So once on the evening of the 26th, when the Bismarck is sighted again, the Ark Royal launches another strike of Ferry Swordfish. The first thing that happens with their strike is that they get out there, and they haven't been told there's an area that they're searching. And they haven't been told that the British destroyer Sheffield is also in that area. And it's nighttime, so they see the ship, and all of a sudden they go down to attack her. And then the lead guy in the flight realizes that it's a British ship and starts waggling his wings to try and indicate to the other pilots, hey, this is a mistake, and he pulls off. But the rest of the pilots don't see it, and they launch their torpedoes. Now, fortunately, the captain of the Sheffield is alert enough to what's going on that he manages to take evasive maneuvers, and there are no hits. And then so the Ferry Swordfish has a crew of 3: the pilot, the navigation officer, and the gunner who sits back with a 30 caliber machine gun. As they're sort of flying, they realize what they've done. The Swordfish go flying by, and they signal the Sheffield to let them know, oops. And the message they send is, sorry about the Kipper. The Kipper being the 18-inch torpedo that they've just, a series of them. And the captain was incensed, right? Because it's bad enough that you're out there looking for the Bismarck, right? But, of course, to get attacked by your own planes. So that's at 2 in the afternoon, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 26th. At 7 o'clock, or 7:10, they're relaunched for a second attack, and yes?
Did the Bismarck have to go to rest?
Not at this point. She had a large enough fuel load that she could go to Saint-Nazaire, or she could operate for a while. She had enough fuel. She wasn't going at her max speed after the Battle of the Denmark Strait because there was no one around. She got lost in the fog. The Suffolk and the Norfolk were out of sight. So she was still within the parameters of her operational range. At about 22:38, that's 10:30. There's a funny thing if you read these the things about this. So there's Greenwich Mean Time, right? But the British are on British Summer Time, which is 2 hours ahead of Greenwich Mean Time. And this all happens, so a lot of times it's hard to know exactly what time it is, even if you're not trying to calculate the 24-hour clock. But at about 10:30 at night, the ferry Swordfish, from the second attack, it's the same guys who are mostly pretty embarrassed about the first go-around, find the Bismarck and attack. They get 3 hits, the third of which hits the Bismarck astern and jams her rudder hard to port. This is the death of the Bismarck. Because now, although jams one of her rudders, she has 2 rudders, but she jams one of them hard to port. So now she's always wanting to go off to the side, and she's having trouble making way in the direction that she wants to go. And she's spotted the next day by a British destroyer, and the British destroyer said, yeah, she made 2 gigantic circles, so I think something's wrong. Now, the Germans try a number of things. They have this idea that the compartment behind where this is happening is flooded, or forward of it, obviously, since the rudder is the last thing on the ship. But one of them suggests, well, why don't we just put some explosives on the rudder, and we'll just blow it off, right? Because we can't fix it. But Lütjens realizes that this is a terrible idea because what's more likely to happen if you do that is you're going to blow off 1 or 2 of the screws, and then the ship is just going to be dead in the water. But Lütjens realizes after a point that they're not going to be able to get away. And he sends a message at 11:40 on May 26. Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Fuhrer. And then he announces something like this over the loudspeaker on the ship, which, according to survivors of the Bismarck, had a pretty devastating effect on morale. One of them, a guy named Reckberg Mühlheim, I think is his name, he's the 4th gunnery officer, said that he went into one of the crew rooms. All the crews were just lying on the floor, like they had emptied out the supply lockers, because they were like, well, we're all gonna buy it now. Like, we might as well eat up all the ice cream that's on the ship. On Tuesday, the 27th of May, with the Bismarck only able to make about 18 knots, she's converged on first by, that's King George V under Sir John Tovey. She's a beautiful ship. I mean, her guns are shining. God, it's just an absolutely beautiful, beautiful ship. King George V is like Prince of Wales, but better. That is to say, she's had her workup cruise, so all her guns work. Also, HMS Rodney. HMS Rodney is an old school battleship, which means she's heavily armored and kind of slow, but she has 16-inch guns. And what happens then, this is the battleship, the destroyer Dorsetshire, who comes into the story a little bit later. Bismarck is essentially helpless. She starts firing when the Dorsetshire, or when the KGV and the Rodney rock up on her. But she's essentially a sitting duck because she can't alter course effectively. And she's not so much sunk by the Rodney and the King George V as beaten to death. King George V and Rodney fired over 300 shells at her, setting her on fire, but not sinking her, killing a large proportion of her crew, but not sinking her. One shell took out the bridge, taking out pretty much the entire command crew of the ship. This is HMS Rodney firing at the Bismarck, and you can see the Bismarck kind of. You could see it if it was a better picture, but of course this is what the circumstances will allow. But you can see she's very much on fire in the background here. Here's another picture. Once again, you can see the Bismarck. You can see the flames shooting out of her. So this is the morning of May 27th, excuse me. At about 8:47 was when the Rodney opened fire on her. 9:02, a 16-inch round salvo from Rodney struck the forward superstructure, damaging the bridge and the main fire control director, and killing most of the senior officers. By about 9:30, the Bismarck's main guns are out of action, and First Officer Hans Oos, the only surviving senior officer, orders that the ship be scuttled. There was some debate for a long time about what actually sunk the Bismarck. For a long time, the British Navy said, well, we sunk it. We fired 300 shells into it. Trust me, we were and in fact, the Bismarck was going to go down, ultimately, but the Germans said, no, we scuttled it. Like, we sunk the ship. By this point, the Rodney has closed to about 3,000 yards, which if you think 12,000 yards is point blank range, 3,000 yards is we're just going to fire shells into the side of this thing until it goes down. And that's, once again, the Rodney is very big and very slow, but it doesn't really matter at this point because the enemy can't shoot back. Toward the end, the Dorsetshire, the destroyer, and the King George V closed to torpedo range and started. They just couldn't, the Bismarck was a very well-built ship, I think, because it sustained an incredible amount of damage. So the Bismarck sinks or is scuttled depending on whose version you believe. They've gone now down, they've done submersible research, and it's pretty clear that it was the scuttling. Like you can see on the wreck, you can see the blowout from where the scuttling charges happened. She's in about 15,000 feet of water. A significant number of her crew had already been killed, but many of them went into the water, maybe 300. And the Dorsetshire and another destroyer, the Maori, went and started to pick them up. The Dorsetshire picked up about 85 of their soldiers. This is the Dorsetshire here, and you can see them pulling German sailors out of the sea. The Maori picked up another 25. But then the Dorsetshire spotted something that they thought looked like a submarine. And they were just like, we're out of here. We're not going to stick around just bobbing in the water while a German submarine is. And in fact, U-556, German U-boat, had spotted the British ships the day before, but she was out of torpedoes because she had fired them into merchant ships. And apparently the commander was like smashing his hand on the desk because here he had a bunch of British ships just sort of hanging around, perfect targets, and he just had we had no torpedoes to shoot them with. But so the Dorsetshire and the Maori see what looks to be a German submarine, and they say, we're out of here. We're not going to stick around. Sorry, guys. And the rest of the crew of the Bismarck, probably, hard to know how many were in the sea, but the Bismarck had a crew of about 1,600. So about 1,400 of them go to the bottom. So the hunt for the Bismarck, starting with the Battle of the Denmark Strait and finishing with this absolute beatdown in the Eastern Atlantic, is significant because, once again, it's the last of the great ship-to-ship battles that you're going to see that had characterized naval warfare ever since the 15th, 16th century, right? So this is the last of these cases, and the reason is because these ships are incredibly expensive, and they're great until they sink, right? So the Hood going down was it was a blow to British morale. The Hood figured very prominently in the British national, the Navy figures prominently in the British national idea in the way that, the US Navy is great and we all have great respect for them, but they don't figure in the national psyche in the way that the British Navy does, right? Because the British Navy is the one that is the entity that connects them to their colonies. It's the entity that for hundreds of years has been the thing that protected them from the depredations of the continental European powers, like, when Napoleon had threatened to invade the UK, they'd said, well, there are bitter weeds here. You won't like it here. And periodically the continental powers had sort of, we're going to come and get you, to which the British have said, good luck with that. We have this gigantic navy. So in the future, this is the beginning of the change in naval warfare, and you can see the continuation of that change in the Pacific in 1942 and 1943, when aircraft carriers become the coin of the realm. Navy that we really remember from the Second World War, okay, the battleship Missouri, because that was where the surrender happened, but the Enterprise and the carriers that fought the Battle of the Coral Sea, the carriers that won the Battle of Midway, and the naval aviators who fought on them. And now, that's the way naval warfare, I should say, is done, has been done since then. Although now it's sort of changing too. Those of you who follow the way naval warfare is going now, like guided missile cruisers are more of the sort of coming thing. But so this is this sort of fantastically interesting moment when you have these acts of real bravery. I mean, all these guys out on these boats in the open water in 18, 20, 25-foot seas, doing this, you know, this incredibly daring thing. I mean, there's a kind of romantic thing to it. Interestingly, too, and I meant to mention this earlier, but I will point out, Hitler was never very interested in the Navy. Hitler was an infantryman. Those of you who know his history will remember he had won the Iron Cross in the First World War as a corporal. He didn't like the Navy very much because the German Navy was the kind of least Nazified of the German military services. But he also didn't like the Navy because ships are expensive and they're not cool in the way that they don't march by you like goose stepping. They don't, you know, they're not cool in the way that Hitler saw cool, if you want to put it in those terms. So that, by the way, one of these ships, and I think it may have been it could have been the Tirpitz, but one of them, they had offered to name it the Adolf Hitler, right? And he was like, no, I don't think we're going to do that, because if it gets sunk, right, that's metaphorically not a great sign for the Third Reich. You know, in a way, the Kriegsmarine, I mean, and also he was not very happy with Erich Raeder for sort of, you know, not being more gung-ho about the idea of invading Great Britain or invading England. I find this a very compelling series of events. It gets back to an older era of the way warfare was done. These guys getting out there, and it's just a toe-to-toe slug. But you also have these guys out on the cruisers doing this job that, you know, we're not here to shoot the Bismarck. We're here to hope the Bismarck doesn't shoot us, and to try and do this very complicated job, much of which is kind of boring, some of which is starkly terrifying. I mean, those moments when the Bismarck sort of turns around, you're like, it's about to go much worse, potentially. It's the end of an era, but it's also a story of you know, incredible bravery, incredible dedication to duty. And I've spent a lot of time putting together this talk, thinking about the guys serving on the Hood, and you know, the dedication that took them out on the open ocean and eventually cost them their lives. But also the courage of the people on those British ships who knew that the defense of their country and the defense of the empire called on them to do this thing that not everybody in the world can do. And that, I think, is particularly impressive. So that was a lot of talk. And if people have questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. But you may just want to go have a coffee and not hear my voice either. So as you like.
Did you see the movie and what did you think?
I did. I think it's an excellent movie. It was done off, I believe, to a great extent off the memoirs of a guy named Ludovic Kennedy, who served on one of the destroyers, I think. And it's really well done. It's really, really well done. I think it's due for an update, though, and I'll tell you why. Because now, with the computer-generated animation, I mean, those of you who've seen Midway, there are some incredible shots in Midway. The Midway movie, by the way, gets a lot of things right. They compress a few things, they compress a few characters, but they really get a lot of things right. I mean, somebody described trying to bomb a ship from an airplane as like trying to hit a skittering cockroach with a ping pong ball held out at arm's length. And you really get that sort of, you know, that sort of impression. But I just imagine what you could do with computer-generated animation that would, I mean, because this is perfect for it. You just have these big ships, and the way they move is so beautiful, and the way, if you see you could, by the way, if you look online, you can see there's actually film that guys on the Prinz Eugen took of the battle, and you can see the splashes like off around the Bismarck. You can't see to the British ships because those are those are about 18 miles away or 16 miles away, and B, they're on the other side of for some reason they were always they were always shooting from the port side of the ship for whatever reason, so or from the starboard side, excuse me. So for some reason they were always not on the right side to see where although they do get pictures, you can kind of see that there's that picture, and that was taken from the Prinz Eugen which probably is the hood exploding. Yes, sir.
What happened to the cruiser?
Oh, Prince Eugen. Yeah, I forgot to mention that. In the course of when she cruises out after the Battle of the Denmark Strait, and then she gets attacked by the swordfish from the Victorious, the first one, then she's like, well, Prince Eugen needs to get away from us, A, because she has a job to do, and B, because they're really looking for us now. And the Lütjens and Lindemann, I think, realized that being near them was dangerous for Prince Eugen and not doing them any good, right? I mean, it's not, because when the capital ships roll up, Prince Eugen and her 8-inch guns, they, to quote the captain of the gunnery, one of the gunnery officers on the Merrimack during the Merrimack and the Monitors fight, I could probably do as much by snapping my fingers every 2 minutes. Like there's really not much that the Prince Eugen has to offer. So she is told to go on the 24th, I believe, off into the Atlantic. Eventually she gets captured at the end of the war, and I believe, if I recall correctly, I could be wrong about this, but I believe that she's one of the ships that's positioned near Bimini Atoll for the H-bomb test, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, sir.
Kind of a naive question, but you don't assemble a ship and put on a crane and determine it's 30,000 tons. How do they weigh each individual parts of the ship? How do they determine it reaches a certain tonnage?
Partly it's the size, partly it's the components, and they also have a sort of unweighted tonnage and a loaded tonnage, so they know, roughly speaking, it's, as I understand it, it's basically by weighing the parts as they go together and by how big the ship is. I mean, but yeah, you're right. You can't just put it on a scale. Although they do, it's incredible if you ever see these ships go into dry dock. It's just a remarkable process. I mean, these things are. My cousin served for a while on the USS Tarawa, and these things are just. For those of us who are not used to them, I mean, they're just a startlingly large piece of equipment. I mean, I have a friend who owns a Centurion Mark V main battle tank. For what reason, it's hard to explain, but he does. And when I first got near that thing, I was like, wow, this is big. But then, I got near, when the naval ships would come into Portland for the Rose Festival, I was like, oh my God, these are destroyers, and these things are huge. Oh, wow. But then the dry dock facilities are really, you really get like a respect for human capacities to know that you could build something that big and that you could get a ship into it without smashing everything involved to pieces. Yes?
Yeah, the Texas is down, I think, in Houston, and years ago, I remember you were on there, you're right, you get on those things and you just realize they're immense.
Now, that having been said, the inside of them is pretty confined, and especially because they have like multiple bulkheads in them, so that if the ship takes a hit, it doesn't flood the whole inside. And the British were really pioneered this because what happened with some of these ships, at least that were sunk in the Battle of Jutland or the Battle of Jutland, is that a German shell got down into the cordite. Cordite is the stuff that makes the shells go, and when that flashes, it sets off everything. And so the British invented the concept, or not invented, but one of the things that would happen before a British ship was going to go into battle was that one of the officers would go down and make sure that it was what was called flash tight, so that the areas that contained the cordite were shut off from the other areas of the ship, so that they took a hit, the cordite wouldn't set off everything else. I think, but I'm not 100% sure, that spout of flame that everybody said that they saw. The captain of the Prince of Wales was looking toward the Bismarck at the time, and he said that he didn't see the hood explode, but that the whole cabin, the whole bridge that he was standing on, was all of a sudden just lit up by the light. And the explosion was so powerful that the guys on the Bismarck felt the blast when the hood went up, and it was 9 miles away when that happened. So that's a pretty massive blast. Go ahead.
I read the book by bombarded,
Yeah.
How some would have it after it's sunk. And
Yeah, there's a really great documentary you can find on YouTube of them going down to that wreck, and it's incredibly deep too. I mean, it's deeper than the Titanic as far as I understand, and yeah, what they were able to discover about what the last moments of the ship was like was absolutely fascinating, and really sometimes I wonder about going to those wrecks, and I'm just like, geez, why? Like, what do we have to? But in both cases, they've been to the wreck of the Hood too, and what they found out was that the Hood, one of the sort of questions about the Hood was, where would she, so there's a couple of theories about the Hood. One is that the plunging fire straight down through the deck. One is that, and this happened to another one of the British ships, that a shell traveled underwater and exploded beside the ship and beneath the armor belt. And then another theory is that that happened and it set off one of her torpedoes, and there was a sort of chain reaction explosion. But they also weren't sure like what the position of the Hood was relative to the Bismarck. So it's clear once they dove on her, that the thing that blew her up was they're pretty clear from where the explosion was that it was the 4-inch ammunition and then the 15-inch. But also they know that that Hood had started her turn to try and get side on so she could bring her rear guns to bear. And they hadn't really known that before. But it's, and people are just like, well, Admiral Holland erred by firing his first shots at the Prince Eugen and not at the Bismarck. I'm not sure it would have mattered. I'm not sure it would have mattered. Just given the fragility of those ships, I mean, maybe. But he was, once again, he was only firing his 2 forward turrets at the Bismarck. So at whichever British ship when he was shooting, or German ship. So I'm not sure it would have made that much difference because he was outgunned in the moment because both the German ships could bring all 8 of their guns to bear on him. All right, thank you so much.